Now, the third social psychology experiment we're going to look at, and last of the ones I'm going to require you to look at, although I'll add one more, is the most famous of the lot. This is known in circles as the Stanford prison experiment. And it was conducted in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo in Stanford University, another very prestigious American university. And you've probably heard of this. It involved volunteers again, all male, no women involved except for one cameo by his girlfriend. The volunteers were, in this case, actually randomly assigned to one of two roles, to be either guards or prisoners in a mock prison that was built in the basement of the psychology department. The original plan foresaw a two-week period, 14 days, but, and here comes the only woman in this story, Zimbardo's girlfriend raised concerns after 6 days about the well-being of the volunteers, and the whole thing was abandoned. Now, I was going to put some further information here, as I did for the last one, from a psychology website. But after reviewing the materials there, I was shocked to find that this is still spoken of as if it were an experiment, as if there were findings, as if any conclusion was warranted from this. Let's be 100% clear. The Stanford prison experiment was not a scientific experiment, though it is often treated as it were, and it is entirely illegitimate to draw any conclusions from it. It does not tell us anything one way or another about humans, except for the specific humans who took part in this. It was not conducted in a manner that could ever have informed science, and it did not lead to any conclusions that we can rely on. That's up front. So when we approach the Stanford prison experiment, we need to sort out three separate topics. One is what happened in 1971 in Stanford, and we'll have a look at that. The next, though, is the myths and the stories that arose around that event, especially as propagated by Philip Zimbardo himself. Now, Philip Zimbardo is still, astonishingly, a recognized psychologist. He rose to be head of the American Psychological Association, and he has another role to play in the story that unfolds here. But he has been perpetuating myths and stories around this himself. And we would need to ask about what are the social consequences of such myths. In doing so, of course, I am motivated by my own fears. So, going back to 1971, the basement of the psychology department in Stanford was disguised as a mock prison with cells and corridors. There was a lot of cosplay going on in this, so there was fake arrests. Prisoners were so-called arrested at their residences. It says they were made to wear prison issue uniforms. That's not true. They were made to wear surgical smocks, which are a darn sight more demeaning than prison uniforms. They were placed in cells. They were had limited freedom to exercise or to interact. And the story goes that conditions deteriorated. Some guards acted in an abusive manner, and some prisoners showed signs of anxiety or trauma. It's important to realize that all the time this was going on, Zimbardo was in the thick of things. This is not how you conduct an experiment. In an experiment, you set up your conditions and you let the world speak back. Zimbardo was, however, acting more like a movie producer. He was on the floor most of the time, egging the volunteers on and clearly influencing their behavior. And it was called off after 6 days. Now, what we know about this is largely through materials that Zimbardo himself curates on a website that he manages. Some of the images are there. They're notorious. You may have seen these images before. The original study did not generate any data. The original study was not the subject of a scientific review. There were no scientific outcomes. But the story of the Stanford prison experiment was so compelling at the time that people started talking about it as if it were an experiment. It's useful to find a source other than Philip Zimbardo about this, and a few years ago on Reddit, One of the original guards from the Stanford prison experiment did one of these "I am a such and such." In other words, he was willing to respond to questions and talk about the experience. So the link is there, and I'll put it in the required readings because I think you really need to read that if you want to understand the whole story. Now, as I said, the story was compelling, and so people started talking about it in terms as if we had found out something. One interpretation that was often repeated was that the brutality of the guards and the suffering of the prisoners resulted in the experiment being abandoned. That needs a lot more nuance, as you'll find out when you read the guards' own report. Within that framing, then, the whole vocabulary of psychology gets brought to bear. It was suggested that guards were depersonalized because of their group identity, that their individuality was lost to the role that they were playing. And then from there, people started to spin themselves fanciful stories about how the tyranny was embedded in the psychology of powerful groups. And so we all have fears in this area, and these are not improbable stories, but they are not the product of science. Okay? These assertions were not supported by any scientific evidence. The idea that group norms provides the acceptable beliefs and behaviors in a group is a very simplistic and cartoonish framing, and if we were to take it at face value, it would stop us looking at the complexities of any kind of conflict situation. Now, unsurprisingly, this experiment, not an experiment, has been heavily criticized. So there was no science, first of all. The simplistic story about the resistance by the prisoners and the tyranny of the guards was not as clear-cut by any means as Zimbardo suggests. Zimbardo's role is glaring here. And nonetheless, despite all this criticism, we still find reports like this from an article in 1973, so 2 years later. Guard aggression was omitted simply as a consequence of being in the uniform of a guard and asserting the power inherent in that role. And comments of this nature were still on that psychology website I was going to point you to for this, and that I did point you to for the Milgram study. It is distressing to see such bad work live so long in the public understanding of science. So we've looked at what happened, and we've looked at the myths around it. What are the consequences when this kind of thing gets out of hand? Well, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, what year was it? I forget. The Americans took over Baghdad, and one thing they took over was a prison, a notorious prison called Abu Ghraib on the outskirts of Baghdad, which had been used as a center for torturing and murder of prisoners by the Iraqis. And the Americans went on to use it as a center for torture and murder. Photographs were released, and the iconic photograph on the lower right is one you may be familiar with. Some of the personnel of the prison were tried in this. It was necessary to have a public trial in order to assuage public outrage at such a thing. One of the expert witnesses called at this trial was Philip Zimbardo, who was presumed to be an expert because of his role in the Stanford prison experiment. Now, the simplistic interpretation of what was going on in 1971 might suggest that he might actually know something about group norms and situational factors. I cannot avoid the conclusion that Philip Zimbardo was a useful stooge in order to prevent any responsibility being taken for a complex situation by people higher up. As I said, his expertise is entirely questionable, but he played a very important political role in limiting the fallout and the damage from this on the American political theatre. We live in a strange world where science is not always taken with the seriousness it deserves. Here's another non-replication from 2006, was actually a reality TV program, The Experiment. There were significant differences between the two, and it just serves to highlight how much the Stanford prison experiment should be recognized for what it was, which is a piece of performance theatre, narcissistic performance art on the part of Philip Zimbardo. It has nothing to do with science, really. And it has been politically exploited. So why did it happen? What were the motivating fears in the 1970s that gave rise to this kind of experiment? Well, if you were around at that time, the civil rights movement was in full swing. There was, as well as civil rights protests and regular images in the media of police and protesters engaged in violent struggle, there were also violent protests around, no, not violent, there were protests, strong protests around the Vietnam War. American society at this stage was very, very fragile, and protest was in the media every day. This might seem familiar. Against the backdrop for that, some of the motivation for the study should be clear, and once more I would encourage you, when you encounter social psychology work, to look at the context in which it arises, to recognize the social fears to which it's responding, and to acknowledge those while you then also critically appraise the nature of the work done.